بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. نويت التعلم والتعليم والتذكر والتذكير والنفع والانتفاع والإفادة والاستفادة والحث على التمسك بكتاب الله وسنة رسوله صلى الله عليه وسلم والدعاء إلى الهدى والدلالة على الخير ابتغاء وجه الله مرضاته وقربه وثوابه سبحانه وتعالى. Alhamdulillah. So today will be our last lesson looking at the Sira of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so today we will look at his farewell Hajj, the Hajjat al-Wada, and the passing of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So we see that in the month of Ramadan, Sayyidina Jibreel alayhi salam would come to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam every Ramadan, and he would sit with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and recite Quran with him. And so they would recite Quran together, and this was every Ramadan. And then in this final, in the 10th year after Hijrah, that we see Jibreel alayhi salam comes to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he completes 2 Qurans with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They recite Quran twice in this month, in the last Ramadan, in the year 10 Hijri. And so the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, now after the month of Ramadan, he sends Mu'adh ibn Jabal to Yemen. And when he sends him to Yemen, he sends him to go and teach the people of Yemen the Quran and their religion. And on the way, the Prophet ﷺ, as he's walking to the outskirts of Medina with Mu'adh, that he says to Mu'adh, he says that maybe this will be the last time that we meet. So this was an indication from the Prophet ﷺ that his passing would be very soon, and that he himself was aware that he would pass away very soon, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But this was the first indication that he gave to any one of his companions. So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam then, he announces that he will go on the Hajj this year himself, and this is the first time he sallallahu alaihi wasallam goes on the Hajj from Medina, and this is when the Hajj became fard. And it said that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam did the Hajj 3 times whilst he was in Mecca, and some say he did it every year, the pilgrimage. But this was the first time he was doing it from Medina sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So it's announced to all the people in Medina and all the tribes and all the Muslims living outside of Medina, and all of the Arabian Peninsula is now Muslim. And so it's news spreads throughout Arabia that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is going on the Hajj, and many had not seen him sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Many had not sat with him, and many had not been to Medina, many had not been to Mecca. So this was an opportunity to go and see this man that they believed in, see the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam for themselves. And so it said that 120,000 Sahaba gathered. Many came to Medina initially and settled and made camp from Medina because they wanted to travel with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam to Mecca with him sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when it comes towards the end of Dhul Qa'dah, that he sallallahu alaihi wasallam 5 days before the end of Dhul Qa'dah, he leaves Medina sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and on the way he stops in Dhul Hulayfa. And it's narrated that as he was walking sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and that everywhere you looked you would see people, that you would look to the left, look to the right, you would see waves of people upon people. And this was all the companions going on the Hajj with him sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and they stopped for a night in Dhul Hulayfa, and then the next day they carried on with their journey towards Mecca. And so the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in Mecca, he performs the Hajj, and when he stands at Arafah, this is where he sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as we know famously, he delivers his what we call the farewell sermon, where he gives the khutbah, his final khutbah, announcing to the Muslims, and he reminds them of their faith and what Islam teaches us, and some of the things where Muslims we will fall short, such as that he reminds us about our treatment of women, that he says, إِنَّمَا خَزْتُمُوهُنَّ بِأَمَانَةِ اللَّهِ, you have taken them as a trust from Allah. And so he reminds us sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and if we look at his final sermon, his farewell sermon, we will see that the things that he brings up sallallahu alaihi wasallam, these are the first things that we as Muslims began to neglect and fall short in. And so the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam reminds us, and he reminds the Muslims, and this sermon is not only for that time but for all times and even for us today. And it's recommended that we read his sermon, and it's available. So then he sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he slaughters 63 camels himself sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and then Ali karamallahu wajhu slaughters 37 on the behalf of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam leaves him to slaughter the 37, but the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he slaughters 63 himself. So that gives us altogether 100 camels. So then we see when he returns to Medina sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that we now see this is the start of the phase of the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, where he enters into his final illness, which he passes away from sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And that one night when he was at home and he was with Muwayhiba, and he calls Muwayhiba and he says, let's go to the cemetery, let's go to Baqi, that I've been commanded to go there and make dua. That Jibreel came to the Prophet ﷺ telling him, go to Baqi and make dua for the deceased. So he calls Muwayhiba and he says, let's go and make dua at Baqi. And when he goes there ﷺ, he then is speaking to Muwayhiba, and he says to Muwayhiba, he says, I've been given keys to this world's treasures and the power to enjoy them forever, or meeting my Lord and enjoying paradise. So Allah has given me an option of having the treasures of this world and power, and I can enjoy them forever, or that I meet my Lord, I meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and enjoy paradise. So Muwayhiba, he says to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says, take both, Ya Rasulullah. Take both of them, have the pleasures of this world forever, and you will also meet your Lord as well one day and enjoy paradise as well. So take both of them. And the Prophet ﷺ, he says, no, rather I have chosen my Lord, that I have chosen to meet my Lord. And so again, this was a clear indication now from the Prophet ﷺ to one of his companions, and the first time he's mentioned to any companion that he will be passing away ﷺ. So this was clear from him ﷺ to one of his companions. And so then we see, then no sooner than he returns home ﷺ, and the next day that when he comes home, that he begins to complain of a headache ﷺ. And this was as soon as he left the graveyard, and that next day the headache got more severe and more severe ﷺ. And this was in the month of Safar, in the 11th year after Hijrah. And he complains to Aisha about his headache, and he ﷺ, when he had this headache, and when he had any sickness, he would recite the 3 quls and he would rub upon himself. And he did such that when he had this headache, he was still going out and meeting people. He was still going and staying in his different wives' houses. He was still fulfilling everybody's rights. He was still counseling people. He was still having visitors to his home, even though he was sick, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But he would read the 3 quls and he would rub upon himself. And so his wives then see that he's deteriorating and he's getting worse and the headache's not getting better. And so he would wrap something around a cloth around his head to alleviate the pain. And his wife saw him in this state, and they wanted him to be comfortable rather than having to move from wife's house to house, that they wanted him to just stay somewhere and be comfortable until he gets better. So they said to him, Ya Rasulullah, we've give up our rights and you stay wherever you want to stay. So he says, I want to stay with Aisha. And so they all agree, and they take him to the house of Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha. So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, now he's in a state where he has the headache is really severe, and not only a headache, now fever has come upon him sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And the fever is intense, that they say that he would sweat sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and you can feel the heat coming off his body, and that you can touch his turban if he was to wear the turban, and you would feel the heat coming through it. And this was such fever that he had sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so he now then goes out to his Sahaba, that he would see them praying, and he didn't come out sallallahu alaihi wasallam himself to pray. And so then when he comes out, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to pray with his, to see his Sahaba, he tells his wife, saying Aisha, he says to her, bring me water, and she brings water, and he bathes, and he does a ghusl, and then he goes out to his companions. And when his companions see him, they're overjoyed that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam has come out, and so he goes to the minbar, and he sits on the minbar sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he says to them, when the Sahaba are listening, he says, a servant of Allah, a servant of God has been given choice of best of this world, or what is with him, with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this servant has chosen Allah. And the Sahaba are listening to this, and the only one who reacted was Sayyidina Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu ta'ala anhu. When he hears this, he begins to weep. He begins to weep because this is the companion of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who's been by the side of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam for decades, even before prophecy. That Abu Bakr was the companion of the Prophet ﷺ, and he was a sahibu fil ghar. He was his companion in the cave. He was his companion on the hijrah. He was his companion in Mecca. He was his companion when he came down from Mount Hira, and he was his companion before that. And so the Prophet ﷺ was dear to Abu Bakr, as was Abu Bakr dear to the Prophet ﷺ. So Abu Bakr understands immediately what the Prophet ﷺ means, that who is this servant, and he sits there and he begins to weep, and then he shouts out, he says, may our mothers and our fathers be sacrificed for you, Ya Rasulullah. May our mothers and fathers be ransomed for you, Ya Rasulullah. When the Sahaba hear this, they realize now, okay, the Prophet ﷺ is talking about himself. He is that servant that he's mentioning. And so then the Prophet ﷺ speaks about Abu Bakr, and he says, no one, you see him consult Abu Bakr now, and he says, no one has been more generous to me than Abu Bakr. And he says, if I were to take an intimate companion, it would be Abu Bakr. And he says, leave no doorway open to the masjid except Abu Bakr's. That those who had their houses adjacent to the masjid and a doorway leading onto the into the masjid, that those doors will be closed except the door of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiallahu ta'ala anhu, that his door shall remain open. And this was an indication from the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who will be the Khalifa after he passes away. That Abu Bakr, being the Imam and the Khalifa, his door is left open for him to arrive into the masjid. And so the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he goes home, he tells Sayyidina Aisha, he says, call Abu Bakr so that I can draw up a written statement designating him as a successor. And he then tells Sayyidina Aisha, because he's no longer able to go out and pray himself with the Sahaba, so he says, go and call Abu Bakr. Go call Abu Bakr and tell him that he should lead the companions, lead the people in prayer. So Aisha says to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, she says, Ya Rasulullah, he's a delicate man, that he weeps, he cries when he reads the Quran, when he prays. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam ignores her, and he says, go call Abu Bakr and tell him to lead the people. And so she says it again. This is Aisha saying about her father, and the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam says it again, and he says the third time, go call Abu Bakr to lead the prayer. And he's angry now that I'm telling you to do something, you're saying he's weak, go and call Abu Bakr and tell him to lead the prayer. And so Sayyidina Aisha then goes to Hafsa radiallahu ta'ala and says, go and speak to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and maybe you can speak to him and say, don't choose Abu Bakr, because he'll begin to weep and he cries when he reads the Quran. And so Hafsa goes to the Prophet ﷺ, and he says, go and call Abu Bakr, tell him to lead the people in prayer. And Sayyidina Hafsa, she says, Ya Rasulullah, he's a delicate man. When he reads the Quran, he cries too much. And the Prophet ﷺ gets angry 3 times, and then he gets angry again. And he says, go and call Abu Bakr, tell him to lead the people in prayer. And he says it angrily, and Hafsa says that Aisha she did me no favors, she did me no good. Radiallahu ta'ala anhum, may Allah be pleased with Abu Bakr and Umar and Hafsa and Aisha and all the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, in this state, we would see that the fever had taken over him sallallahu alaihi wasallam to such an extent that he would faint from that fever sallallahu alaihi wasallam and the headache, and then he would come back to consciousness and he would faint again, and he would ghusl, he would wash, and he would faint again. and he would come back to regain consciousness, and he would do ghusl again, and this would keep happening. And each time he would wake up, he would say to Aisha, "Is there money in the house?" And she would say, "Yes, Ya Rasulullah." And he said, "Go give it in sadaqah." And then he would faint, and when he would wake up, the first thing he would say, "Aisha, did you give that money in sadaqah?" And she would say, "No, Ya Rasulullah, we've been busy taking care of you." And he said, "Go give it in sadaqah." And he would faint. And then he would wake up again. The first thing he would say to her again is, did you give the money in sadaqah?" And he kept asking this until she went and gave the money in sadaqah. Because he said to her, "Ya Aisha, how would I meet my Lord, and in my house is this money, things of this dunya?" And so he sallallahu alaihi wasallam left this world with nothing, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he gave it all away. And where are we today, where we try to save thousands and hundreds of thousands and try to save millions, and that we leave that behind, and we leave all this wealth behind for what reason? That we leave this, when we leave this dunya, we're not going to take any of that with us. And so the Prophet ﷺ told Aisha to give all of this away. And then on the 12th of Rabi al-Awwal, the Prophet ﷺ, he looks out of his window and he sees his Sahaba, and the Sahaba see him looking, and when they see him looking, they are overjoyed with happiness and overcome with happiness, radiallahu ta'ala anhum, that the Prophet ﷺ is getting better. All these days we haven't seen him, and that now he's got up and he's looking out of his window, and that he's better. So they all were overcome with joy, radiallahu ta'ala anhum. And so he signals to them, he says, "Continue with your prayer." And he signals to them that they continue. And he sallallahu alaihi wasallam, then when he was in this state, he would cool himself down by placing his hand in water, and he would wipe the water onto his face, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, to cool himself down. And remember, in those times you didn't have fans, and we didn't have electricity and the like. And inshallah, many of us have been to Mecca and Medina, and those of us that haven't, Allah allow us to go, but we've seen the extreme heat even in the winter. And so we see that the Prophet ﷺ, in this state where he's intense fever, he would place his hand in the water and wipe it onto himself, and then he would say, "There is no La ilaha illallah, there is no God but Allah, and with death comes affliction." And he would repeat this, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And his wives were there around him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. His daughter Sayyidina Fatima, his only child that's left, she comes into the room, she enters into the house, and she sees her father lying there in such a state, and so she begins to weep. And she looks at her father and she says, "Oh, my father, look at the state of my father." So she looks at him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and she begins to weep and cry. And look at her father comfort his daughter. He calls her near. He says to her, "Fatima, come closer." He summons her and she's crying. And then he says to her, she says, "Oh, my father, you're suffering so badly." And he says, "My daughter, that there will be no suffering for your father after this day. And there will be no suffering for him after this day. All those people that caused him harm, all that harm from this dunya, that there will be no suffering for him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam." And he never once complained about anything that happened in this dunya, even though all that suffering and all that hardship that he went through, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, never once did he complain to his Lord. He would complain about himself, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his own weakness. He would say, "I'm the one who's weak, I'm the one that has lack of means," sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so he says to Sayyidina Fatima, he says that after this day your father will suffer no more. And so he calls her near and he whispers to her, and it's narrated that first she begins to weep, she begins to cry when he whispers to her, and then he calls her near again and he whispers a second time, and she begins to smile. And so Sayyidina Aisha, when she was later asked, Sayyidina Fatima radiallahu ta'ala anha, first you were weeping and then you cried, what did the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam say to you? And so she said that when he called me close the first time, he said that your father will not live much longer, and you will be the first from my family to meet me. And so she began to weep, knowing that her father will pass away and that death was near to him. And so then he called me closer a second time, and he says to me that, are you not pleased that you are the leader of women in Jannah? And so she began to smile, radiallahu ta'ala anha. So then we see that the wives are sitting there, and Abdullah bin Abu Bakr, he walks in, radiallahu ta'ala anhu, and he's a brother of Sayyidina Aisha. As he walks in, the Prophet ﷺ gazes upon him, and his eyes won't leave because he has a siwak on him, which he has just cut off a tree, and he has this siwak, and the Prophet ﷺ is just looking at the siwak. And this is the state that he wants to meet his Lord, that even before he passes, he wants to do the siwak. And that he ﷺ, if he said, if I did not fear for my people, I would have made the siwak obligatory, I would have made it fard. It shows the great what a sunnah that they're doing the siwak is. Again, this is a sunnah that which we have left, and we should try to revive in this month of Ramadan. And so he sees the siwak, and Aisha sees that he's looking at it, and so she says, Ya Rasulullah, do you want the siwak? And he nods that yes. So she takes the siwak from her brother Abdullah, and she moistens it herself, softens it herself with her own saliva, and then she does the siwak on the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then in that state, when he's done his siwak, he would raise his hand, and he would say, Allahumma rafiq al-a'la, oh Allah, the higher companion. And he wanted the companionship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when Sayyidina Aisha, she says that when I heard him say this, I knew that he has chosen to meet his Lord rather than remain in this world. And he sallallahu alayhi wasallam, she says, Sayyidina Aisha, that his hand was, and he was saying such, and his hand was in the air, and the hand drops, and he breathes his last breath, sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and he leaves this dunya. And this was on the 12th of Rabi al-Awwal, in the 11th year after Hijrah. The Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam left this world. So Sayyidina Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, she covers the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and he's lying in her lap at this moment, and she covers him, and she lays him down sallallahu alayhi wasallam, and she immediately goes and calls for her father. And she sends Abdullah to go and call her father, who was outside of Medina, who lived with one of his wives who lived further away, and Abu Bakr was there, so she sends for Abu Bakr. Hafsa radiallahu ta'ala anha sends for her father, Sayyidina Umar bin Khattab, and Hafsa being the wife of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so Hafsa sends for her father, and Sayyidina Umar is the first to arrive, and he arrives with Mughira radiallahu ta'ala anhuma, and they both arrive, and Sayyidina Umar looks at the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he sees the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam lying there, and he sees and he says, oh, how beautiful he is even in unconsciousness. How beautiful is he when he's even asleep, he's unconscious. Look how beautiful he is, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And Mughira says, Ya Umar, he's not asleep, he's not unconscious. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the Prophet has passed away, he's died. And then Umar angrily reacts to Mughira, and he says, you're a liar. You're a liar. The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is not dead, and he cannot die. He's not dead. And he says, anyone that will say such, I will kill him. And then now news goes out into the masjid, and the Sahaba are waiting in the masjid, and people begin to gather, and news is now spreading that the Prophet ﷺ has passed away. But then there's Umar, one of the closest companions of the Prophet ﷺ, that he's there in the masjid saying that he has not died, and anybody that says such, I will kill them. So there's confusion now, that has he passed away, has he not passed away? And Umar is saying one thing, and the other Sahaba, news coming from the house, is something else. And so then Sayyidina Abu Bakr radiallahu ta'ala anhu as-Siddiq, he arrives, and when he arrives, he goes immediately to the house of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. He enters the house of his daughter and of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he sees the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam lying there, and he removes the sheet from his face, and he kisses him on the forehead radiallahu ta'ala anhu, and at this moment he can hear all the commotion that's going on outside, and with Umar shouting, saying that those who say that the Prophet has died, that I will kill those people. And immediately Sayyidina Abu Bakr radiallahu ta'ala anhu realizes his responsibility, and that the Sahaba in such a state, passing of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and this is a companion that was there with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam from day one. He was always with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he immediately realizes that the message has to continue. The messenger has passed, but the message continues and the message lives on. And so he then comes out radiallahu ta'ala anhu into the masjid, and he sees Umar and he says, Umar, Ijlis, sit down. And Umar sits down and he goes to the minbar, and then he says that those who worshipped Muhammad know that Muhammad has died, but those who worship Allah know that Allah is living and eternal. And then he recites verses of the Quran where he says, وَمَا مُحَمَّدٌ إِلَّا رَسُولٌ قَدْ خَلَتْ مِنْ قَبْلِهِ الرُّسُلُ أَفَإِن مَاتَ أَوْ قُتِلَ انقلبتم على أعقابكم. So Muhammad is not but a messenger. Other messengers have passed on before him. So if he was to die or be killed, would you turn back on your heels to unbelief? Would you leave your faith? And Sayyidina Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, he says, Ya Umar, is this in the Quran? And Abu Bakr says, yes. And he says, as though this is the first time I'm hearing it. And Sayyidina Umar is Hafiz of Quran, but he's just in a state where he's thinking, is this even from the Quran? I've never heard this, but he has heard it. But this was just the state that he was in, radiallahu ta'ala anhu, in a state of shock of hearing the passing of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And there you have Ali karamallahu wajh, who is not able to speak, sitting on the floor. Saying Uthman, who's collapsed radiallahu ta'ala anhu, one of the Sahaba who said, he makes dua, then he said, Ya Allah, take my sight, because I've seen the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I've seen perfection, I've seen beauty, I do not want to see anything after this. And Allah takes his sight at that moment. Allah takes his sight from him. And this was the state of these men and women who were in love with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There's nothing else to describe them other than these men and women were in love with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and in the true sense of the word, of the meaning of the word of love. We've lost that understanding and that meaning, what love means. But these were men and women who were truly in love with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So then it's discussed that where should they bury the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and there's some disagreement. And then Abu Bakr, he reminds them, he says, I heard the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam mention that when a Prophet dies, that he is buried in the place that he dies. So then it's agreed that he's buried in that place where he passed away, in the house of Sayyidina Aisha. So they prepare the janazah, and the body of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, his noble blessed body, ghusl is done on the body, and Sayyidina Ali, Sayyidina Abbas and his two sons, with Usama bin Zayd, the son of Zayd, and Shukran, who was a helper of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They were the ones who helped Sayyidina Ali with the washing of the body, and they then do the kafan, and the Sahaba come to the house of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam to pray the janazah in groups, but praying individually. That there was no imam to lead them, and everybody prayed the janazah separately. And the Sahaba came and they all prayed the janazah prayer, and then he sallallahu alaihi wasallam was buried there with Sayyidina Ali and Sayyidina Karamallahu Wajhu and Sayyidina Abbas, his uncle radiallahu ta'ala anhu, and his two sons, who go into the grave and lower the body of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam into the grave, and he sallallahu alaihi wasallam is buried. And then we know that Sayyidina Abu Bakr as-Siddiq continued with spreading the message of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and continued and carried the banner of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam until he radiallahu ta'ala anhu passes away. And then the Sayyidina Umar, and then Uthman and Ali radiallahu ta'ala anhum. May Allah be pleased with all the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, with his family. May he increase them in their ranks and their stations. And Ya Allah, we ask you that through the reading of this, through these reading of the Sira of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in this month of Ramadan, that he allows us to connect to the Prophet ﷺ, and may it be a glimpse into the life of the Prophet ﷺ, and may we learn from the lessons and the secrets that are within the reading of the Sira of the Prophet ﷺ, and may it not finish here, but may we carry on to continue to read into the life of the Prophet ﷺ and gain an understanding of who he was ﷺ, which inshallah we ask Allah that brings us closer to him ﷺ, brings us closer to his family, brings us closer to his Sahaba, and may it make us from those who walk in his footsteps ﷺ. May it make us from those who carry the message and carry the banner of the Prophet ﷺ, just as Abu Bakr carried that message of the Prophet ﷺ. So we ask Allah in this month of Ramadan that He blesses us with barakah and with mercy and with rahmah, and allows us to take from the secrets of this month, allows us to be with the Prophet ﷺ on the day of Yawm al-Qiyamah. May these lessons be an intercession for us on the day of Yawm al-Qiyamah. May they be a means for us to attain the companionship of the Prophet ﷺ in Jannat al-Firdaus. Ya Rabb, we ask you to forgive our sins and increase us in our ranks and our stations. Ya Rabb, forgive all of those who took part, all of those who listened in, all of those who didn't listen in, anybody that's connected to us and our households. Ya Rabb, we ask you forgive us for our sins in this month of Ramadan, and connect us and our families and our loved ones to the Prophet ﷺ. Make our children walk in the footsteps of Hassan and Hussein radiyallahu ta'ala anhuma. May our women walk in the footsteps of Fatima al-Butul al-Zahra and Khadija al-Kubra and Aisha al-Rida. And may we as men walk in the footsteps of Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman and Ali, and in the footsteps of Sayyid al-Haq Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Ya Rabb, may this be a means and expiation for our sins. Ya Rabb, may the reading of the Sira be expiation for our sins and a means for us to attain your rahmah and your mercy. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. يا ربنا اعترفنا بأننا اقترفنا وأننا أسرفنا على لظى أشرفنا، فتوب علينا توبة تغسل كل هوبة واسترنا العورات وآمرات، واغفر لوالدينا ربي ومولودين وأهلي والإخواني وسائر الخلان وكل ذي محبة أجيرة وصحبة والمسلمين أجمع آمين. رب اسمع فضلا وجود منا لا باكتساب منا بالمصطفى رسولي نحظى بكل سولي، بالمصطفى رسولي نحظى بكل سولي، بالمصطفى رسولي نحظى بكل سولي. وسلم ربي عليه أدى الهبي وآله وصحبه إدادة شي صحبي، والحمد لله في البدء والتناهي. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. في كل لحظة أبدا عدد خلقي ورضا نفسي وزنة عرشي ومداد كلماتي. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك عليه وعلى آله وصحبه. الفاتحة.